Hello, good morning. Welcome everybody to this gorgeous space, to this beautiful opportunity to gather together to remember Sheldon Wolfe, who is a beloved member of this community, along with his family, who is here this morning. Rhoda and Shell were members for 65, I think we said. So I would like to open up by asking, number one, our elder statesman in the nine, our beloved older brother Rabbi, to just welcome us here and to say something about your dad, your mom, why we're here today, and what your family's thoughts were about creating this lecture.
Good morning, everyone, and I recognize a lot of wonderful faces who knew my dad, and of course know my mom. And to be here with you this morning is a very special honor and treat. Of course, this place meant a great deal to my dad. He was bar mitzvah right here in the congregation. He loved to try to count all the light bulbs. I don't know if he ever got to count them all, but he did notice the ones that were out. And he left a note for you. I know it's really great because I can't imagine. And David Cook reminds me that the 49ers are also winning right now, which I know my dad would be very happy about and maybe had something to do with. And the Giants won last night too. But when he died, it was very important for us to do something that would be meaningful in his memory, something that he would be proud of, and something that would carry on his legacy, that both connected to this place that was so special to our family, and also the topic of Israel, which of course is a challenging one today, given all of the very difficult things that are going on in Israel. As my mom said, he would be very concerned and upset about all of the things that are happening. And yet, despite the challenge, we have to think about, like, how do we build these bridges? How do we maintain this connection with this place that's so important to us, despite the political upheaval and the terrible directions that things are going? We need to think about new ways of building bridges, because really that's what my dad was about building bridges and about working on relationships and dealing with difficult things. And he was on the Israel Overseas Committee for many, many years. And would go to Israel and look for he would get so excited about projects that were doing interesting, innovative things in Israel that would bring people together across all kinds of different groups. And I think we're very excited to have Rabbi Jeff Salkin, a friend and colleague, here to be able to sort of kick off and be our inaugural speaker. And we hope this will be something that we'll be able to continue for quite a few years in his memory. So we want to say thank you to Rabbi Jessica Zimmerman-Graf for helping to facilitate this, to make this a possibility. They kind of welcomed this idea with open arms and has been very supportive, so we appreciate that and look forward to a wonderful opportunity to study with Rabbi Jeff Salkin. I'll let Rabbi Jessica give his credentials.
Rabbi Salkin is a prolific author, thinker, writer. He is the person that a lot of American Judaism turns to ask, where are we at and what's going on here, and what do you think, Jeff? And so Rabbi Salkin's column and podcast, Martini Judaism, for people who like to be stirred and shaken. His 12th book is coming out in January about the future of liberal Judaism in America, which is a very important topic. We have to figure out what things are going to look like and kind of be stirred to reimagine. He's written 3 Torah commentaries, and as I've said in the last couple of days, the best thing that he's done in his entire career as a pulpit rabbi, as a writer, a thinker, a speaker, was to be my rabbinic mentor at the Community Synagogue in Port Washington from 2001 to 2003. We had a really extraordinary experience together, and I feel so grateful that I had the privilege to learn from and with you. So many times I have somebody come into my office and I think, okay, what would Rabbi Salkin do? And I channel you all the time, and the learnings that we continue to talk about and to laugh about sometimes, and that have really guided and shaped my rabbinate. So it's a great privilege to be able to welcome you for this first Wolfe memorial lecture and to have you as our speaker today.
Colleague, members of the Wolfe family, members of his extended family. When I spoke with Rhoda and Greg the other evening about Sheldon Wolfe, Zichrono Livracha, they told me that by profession he was a lawyer. His concentration was on estates and trusts. If I might spiritualize his life, I would say that what he was all about in his professional calling was ensuring that everyone had a good future. And therefore, to be in this place that shaped him and so many people is to be in a place that is, in large measure, his enduring Kaddish. His devotion to his family, to this congregation, wherein you heard he was bar mitzvah in 1946, the larger Jewish community of San Francisco itself, the state of Israel, and the people of Israel. That you asked me to remember him in this house of God, in this beautiful landmark of American Jewish striving, is profound and significant. I would also note that young Sheldon Wolfe came to this congregation as a bar mitzvah in 1946. It bears witnessing, therefore, that Sheldon Wolfe was bar mitzvah here at a particularly interesting, poignant, and telling moment in world Jewish history. When he was 12, he would have been conscious enough to know of the end of the Shoah, and by the time he was 15, the state of Israel would be created. No doubt in his home growing up, he would have known about the crisis of refugees, about the DP camps. It is an important moment in Jewish history, and it is one that bears greater investigation, which will have to happen at a different time. And so let me tell a story in his memory, and then let me tell you its implications. A year ago, I landed at Ben Gurion Airport for what was then my 50th trip to the State of Israel. I pulled my luggage out to the curb. I got into a van heading to Jerusalem. The van driver was a man named Avi Yonah, in his 70s, wearing a kippah on his head. He appeared to be an Iraqi Jew. He said, "Here, put your stuff next to me," which I did. However, his interpretation of your stuff and my interpretation of your stuff wound up being entirely different, because my stuff turned out to be my backpack and a briefcase, and by the time we got to Jerusalem, he asked me, "Eifo hamizvada shelcha, where's your suitcase?" With this, I went into total meltdown mode and began to feign a nervous breakdown, which, because he did not understand English, I proceeded to do entirely in Hebrew. It is rather easy to have a panic attack in Hebrew. I shall teach you how to do it. You just say, lo, 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 lo. Ani lo ma'amin, I don't believe this. He said to me, okay. He yelled at me, he called me a few names, many of which I deserved. He asked for my phone number, I gave him my phone number, I got his. And I said, we have to return to the airport. Of course, knowing what you probably know about Israeli security, there was every probability that my suitcase at that moment was toast. literally toast. He said, la, la, la. He made a phone call. And then I heard a voice on the speakerphone. Ken, matzati oto. Yes, I found it. We have to return to the airport, I said. And of course, what's happening is that the cash register is going on in my mind. He said, no. Pulls into a gas station around the corner from the apartment where I would be staying, gets out, and brings me back my suitcase. I am in total awe. I reach into my wallet. I start to pull out some shekels. And he says, Mazet, tip? What, you giving me a tip? Ain't tip. There's no tip. And then he quoted from memory, saying, Katuv b'Torah, it is written in the Torah, this passage from the book of Deuteronomy. If you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your peer. If your fellow Israelite does not live near you, or you do not know who the owner is, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your peer claims it. Then you shall give it back. You shall do the same with that person's ass. You shall do the same with that person's garment. And so too shall you do with anything that your fellow Israelite loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. And then he said to me, Ein tip. There is no tip. Anachnu achrayim. We are responsible. Now I share that story with you because it points to a Jewish obsession, which is the finding and returning of lost objects. There is an entire section of the Talmud, Bava Metzia, that covers this subject. In the ancient temple, there was a chamber where people could bring stuff they had found, and people would search there for what they had lost, the lost and found. The Jerusalem Talmud, in one particular passage, says that every tribe of the Jewish people had a job to do, and it was the job of the tribe of Dan to tag along after all the other tribes and find lost objects that they might have dropped along the way. This is not the only lost object story that I have about Israel. A number of years ago, my young cousin was on a United Synagogue youth trip to Israel, and while she was there, they went north and they toured the grottos at Rosh HaNikra, and while she was there, she was taking some photographs and she dropped her camera into the water. She called her mother heartbroken, and they both concluded that the camera was irretrievably lost. A month after she returned to the States, she got a package. It contained her camera. What had happened? Apparently there were Israel Defense Forces soldiers on maneuvers off the Mediterranean coast, not far from Rosh HaNikra. A diver found the camera sitting at the bottom of the sea. He opened the camera, took out the card, saw photographs of kids wearing USY Minneapolis t-shirts, contacted USY in Minneapolis, asked if anyone who had been on an Israel trip had lost a camera, located her, and that was how my cousin got her camera back. Rak b'Yisrael, I would say. Only in Israel. And so I use this story as a way of framing a larger picture for you and a very large topic for you, which Rabbi Greg Wolfe alluded to. I tell this story because as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel, it is important for us at this juncture to ask ourselves some key basic questions about Jews, Judaism, and the need for Israel itself. I invite you to ask yourselves the following question, which I shall answer for you. What had the Jewish people lost? And what did the State of Israel help us find again? Now, my working definition of Zionism is simply this. the Jewish attachment to the land of Israel and the dream of renewing Jewish sovereignty in our place of origin. It's a very big definition. There are many ramifications, implications, and nuances. But now let's talk about what we lost and what we have found. First, the Jews had lost their sense of themselves as a nation. We Reformed Jews in this city, and not only in this city, taught ourselves that Judaism is only a religion, not a nation. This was enshrined in the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. Now, there were American Reformed leaders in those days and in our times whose opposition to Zionism was roughly akin to the opposition of some Orthodox Jews to Zionism. They saw Judaism primarily as a religious expression, and in my research I've discovered that many early reformers who were anti or non-Zionist were simply uncomfortable with the fact that many of the Zionists were secularists who had contempt for religion. We saw ourselves as a religion. If you had no use for the religious part of who we are, then we were willing to write you off. The Zionists were simply not religious enough for them. A first cousin to this idea is that American Jews should not demonstrate dual loyalty, and that was the essential reason for the creation of the American Council for Judaism, and San Francisco was one of its base cities. The American Council for Judaism was a pressure group within Reform Judaism that saw as its mission a vigorous opposition to Jewish nationalism. Barely conceived was the idea that Jews could in fact have a loyalty to a land, and barely concealed within its agenda was the fear that Americans would accuse Jews of having dual loyalty, an opposition to Zionism and a slur that comes back at regular intervals. Now, this idea became obsolete largely because of the admonition of Justice Louis Brandeis. Loyalty to America demands that each American Jew become a Zionist. For only through the ennobling effect of its strivings can we develop the best that is in us and give to this country the full benefit of our great inheritance. Louis Brandeis believed that a commitment to Zionism would make Jews better Jews and simultaneously into better Americans. Now, some on the left would say that the whole idea of the nation state is passé. A nation state being a state in which there is a dominant ethnic group, a dominant language, a dominant story, which is true, by the way, for every single country in Europe. And it is true of the state of Israel. One of the problems that American Jews have in their understanding of Israel, and one of the problems that Americans have in their understanding of Israel, and this keeps on coming back, is that America is not Israel. Israel is not America. America is not a nation state. It was never intended to be a nation state with one dominant story. And in fact, as you probably know, many of the problems that we are encountering today in America are a result of the malignant desire that there be one dominant story in this country. There's nothing wrong with being a nation state. Asterisk, bottom of page, small print, bold, as long as there is room in the nation state for people with different stories and different languages. That idea, by the way, is found in Israel's founding documents. The late Israeli intellectual Amos Oz wrote this very snarky paragraph. I love snark. In fact, I would really like to take on a project as my next book, A History of Jewish Snark. Or Great Jewish Curmudgeons. The prophets would be in there. He writes, I would be more than happy to live in a world composed of dozens of civilizations, each developing in accordance with its own internal rhythm. No flag, no emblem, no passport, no anthem, nothing. But the Jewish people has already staged a long-running one-man show of that sort. The international audience sometimes applauded, sometimes threw stones, and occasionally slaughtered the actor. No one joined us. No one copied the model the Jews were forced to sustain for 2,000 years, the model of a civilization without the tools of statehood. For me, this drama ended with the murder of Europe's Jews by Hitler. In other words, Amos Oz was saying, we might want to live in a world, the world of John Lennon's song, Imagine. Imagine there's no countries. Imagine no religion. It does not matter to me that Rolling Stone magazine believes that that's the second most important rock song ever written. They believe that the most important rock song ever written is Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan. No surprise. I will share with you that I have always despised that song by John Lennon because I don't want to live in that world. Imagine no possessions. Right now I'm trying to imagine John, Alav Shalom, and Yoko with no possessions. Amos Oz was saying that if a nation wants to divest itself of the trappings of its nationhood, go right ahead. France, Germany, Italy, Greece, go right ahead. After you, Oz was saying. But don't expect the Jews to be the first to divest themselves of their national and particular identities. Don't expect the Jews to be the only universal people in the world, because there is no such thing as a universal identity. I'm just a human being. No, you're not. And our young people know this. There is no such thing as a generic person. Second, and related to this, we lost our sense of our particularity as Jews. The play of the year was Tom Stoppard's play, Leopoldstadt. It might be his final play. It is pure Stoppard. It is about successive generations in the life of an assimilated Jewish family in Vienna. When the play opens, it is the late 1890s, and Hermann and Ludwig are discussing the work of a playwright and journalist named Theodor Herzl. Hermann begins, my grandfather wore a kaftan. My father went to the opera in a top hat. And I have the singers to dinner. This is the promised land, and not because it's someplace on a map where my ancestors came from. We're Austrians now, we're only 1 in 10, but without us, Austria would be the Patagonia of banking, science, the law, the arts, literature, journalism. To which Ludwig responds, but in Galicia, the Jews are hated by the Poles, in Bohemia by the Germans, in Moravia by the Czechs. A Jew can be a great composer, he can be the toast of the town, but he can't not be a Jew. So Herzl comes along and says, we lost our territory, but we can have it again. A country where we're not on sufferance, where we can be what we once were. A country where we do not live on sufferance. Or to quote Blanche Dubois, I've always had to rely on the kindness of strangers. Israel is the place wherein we said to ourselves, we will never again have to rely on the kindness of strangers. The Jews had lost power, and Israel helped them find it again. The late Canadian poet, singer, songwriter Leonard Cohen wrote these words decades ago. Soldiers in close formation, paratroopers in a white Tel Aviv street. Who dares disdain an answer to the ovens? Any answer. I did not like to see the young men stunted in the Polish ghetto. Their curved backs were not beautiful. Forgive me. It gives me no pleasure to see them in uniform. I do not thrill to the sight of Jewish battalions. But there is only one choice between ghettos and battalions, between whips and the weariest patriotic arrogance. He wrote that in the early 1960s. As a footnote, as you will hear, this is the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, and there is a devastatingly wonderful book by Matti Friedman called Who by Fire, which chronicles the moment when Leonard Cohen left the island of Hydra and came to Tel Aviv during that war, thinking that he would volunteer on a kibbutz, but instead was brought down to the Sinai to sing for the troops. It is a glorious, glorious piece of work. What Leonard Cohen was saying is that power presents its own moral challenges, but personally, I prefer a surplus of power with the ability to debate the ethical implications of that power to a deficit of power with unrelenting chanting of dirges over our dead. Hatikva puts it this way, Lihiot am chofshi. We want to be a free people. And for me, by the way, that means leftist comment coming at you. It means a people that will be free from the burdens of occupying another people. But I urge you to read the quotes in the Wall Street Journal of the recent address that Mahmoud Abbas delivered, in which he said that the Jews are not native to the Middle East and that Hitler was right in trying to get rid of the Jews. It was because they were usurers. Let us remember that Mahmoud Abbas got his PhD from a Russian university, and his topic was the denial of the Holocaust. Let us have no illusions. I want a two-state solution, and I have utterly no confidence in the leadership on the other side. You see, my friends, for those who are critical of Zionism, let me be very clear. As I said last night, if you want to talk about the aftermath of 1967, the aftermath of the Six-Day War, that's debatable. If, however, you want to talk about 1948, that there should not have been a state in the first place, I will not go there. For you see, my friends, even in the darkest days of the oppression of Tibet, no one said that China did not deserve to exist. In the days of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the IRA simply wanted the Brits out of Ulster. They didn't want to destroy England. They wanted to dismantle apartheid, not get rid of South Africa. We wanted to get out of Vietnam. We did not want an end to America. It is beneath the dignity of the Jewish people. It is beneath the dignity of any people. No nation must argue the merit of its very existence. As I said last night, of those crowds that yell from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they are calling for a Judenrein, land of Israel. And as far as I can tell, there are a limited number of ways for a place to become Judenrein. There are only 3 ways for Jews to leave: on planes, on ships, and in coffins. I will take none of those choices. The Jews had lost their connection between sacred texts and public life, and Israel helped us find that again. If you remember high school in a non-traumatic way, you might remember science class in which you attended biology class on Monday and Tuesday. On Wednesday and Thursday, you went to the laboratory where you were able to see in real time and in real life everything that you had learned in the classroom on Monday and Tuesday. The centuries of diaspora living were the Monday and Tuesday of Jewish history. We sat in the classrooms, we created our texts, we studied them. But Israel is the Wednesday and Thursday of Jewish history. Israel is the lab. And in that lab, we engage in a bold and grand experiment. Do these texts and values actually have anything to say about how we live, how we create a civil society, how we engage in power? And sometimes it happens in the sweetest and most innocuous of ways. This past summer, I was in Jerusalem and I developed a heat rash. So I went to a dermatologist, and when he asked me what was wrong, I said to him in Hebrew, "Ne'eli sha'ani mitzorah." It occurs to me that I might be a leper. Mitzorah is the term in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, mostly, for someone who has a particular skin disease, probably psoriasis. This man had all the bearings and markings of a secular Israeli. Nevertheless, he laughed because he got the reference. Israelis live with their literature, I will argue, far more than we Americans live with ours. In other words, if someone quoted to you from Longfellow or Hemingway, you might not get it. But Israelis live with their literature and their culture. The Jews had lost their spoken language, and Israel helped them find it again. Whenever I go to Israel, when I go to the synagogue, I always sit close to the windows where I have a stereophonic experience. With one ear, I hear the chanting of the ancient Hebrew. With the other ear, coming from the playground outside the synagogue, I hear children laughing and playing and taunting each other in modern Hebrew. This is nothing less, my friends, than the resurrection of a language, the resurrection of a culture. Hebrew was lost, it had died, it came back. The Jews had lost their connection to holy space, and Israel helped them find it again. Ever since the destruction of the Second Temple, our holy places had been private, the home, and most specifically, the table, and the public and the civic, the synagogue. But as for the holiness and spirituality that we could find in a land, it was missing and or lived in deferment. What draws me to Israel is the spiritual power of being in a place that is sacred. A number of years ago in Jerusalem, I was walking to a friend's house for Shabbat dinner, and I stopped on a hill and I looked out at the sunset to the west. An old woman came and stood there, and we stared at it together in silence. Finally, she said to me in Hebrew, "Ata yodea shel rov ha'anashim lo yiru et ze." You do know that the overwhelming majority of people will never see this. She was right. On two levels. Most people never get to see a sunset in Jerusalem. I'm embarrassed to say to you that a ridiculously large number of British Jews have seen sunsets in Jerusalem. French Jews, Argentinian Jews, Canadian Jews. the smallest percentage of Jews living in any country that have seen a sunset in Jerusalem are American Jews. Of all diaspora communities, the smallest percentage of Jews who have visited Israel even once happens to be American Jews. Now, this is changing because of birthright. But that will point to a different problem that we might address in the comments. What blocks our ability to see the sunset in Jerusalem? 50 years ago, on Yom Kippur, the combined Arab armies launched a surprise attack on Israel, the second in 6 years. If you saw the movie Golda, and by the way, I do recommend that you see the movie Golda, if only for Helen Mirren's spectacular performance, that if the world was working correctly would get an Oscar for Best Actress. I have my dark suspicions as to whether there will be that nomination. And also because it will be up for a second Academy Award. The Academy Award for the largest amount of nicotine consumed in any major motion picture. I have never seen anything quite like it. She was even smoking as she was getting cancer treatments. There's a moment in Golda where she said to her aide that if the Egyptians were to take Tel Aviv, she said, "I will not be taken alive." She was planning to commit suicide. She was planning and preparing for her own private Masada. In his recently published memoir, the publisher and editor of the New Republic, Martin Peretz, reminisces about those fatal days. All of you who were conscious then will know what I am talking about, but I will say to you that I had forgotten how precarious it was. He reminisces about conversations that he had with Simcha Dinitz, who was then Israel's ambassador to the United States. Marty is an inveterate name dropper. He writes, "I'd call Simcha every morning at 6 or 7, and he'd have spoken to Henry already." That would be Henry Kissinger, who this year celebrated his 100th birthday. "I trusted Simcha never to tell me something that wasn't true. On the second day, all he said was, 'Everything is at stake.'" 50 years later, everything is at stake. The election of this current government of Israel, with its extreme right-wing, racist, homophobic, and let us be honest, the majority of American Jewry-phobic elements, has shaken the Jewish world in a way that we've rarely seen. It is true that Israel has endured right-wing governments in the past, but this feels very different. History will say, and is already saying, that Menachem Begin was right-wing and simultaneously a classic liberal. And that's not even in comparison. Yes, judicial reform was necessary. It should be welcome, it is welcome. It was already in process. The way that judges would be appointed, which is basically judges appointing their successors, is insane. It goes back to the original sin of a country without a constitution, which Megillat Atzmaut, which the Declaration of Independence, literally the scroll of independence, had called for the establishment of and the righting of, but a war got in the way. This is about a corrupt government that is seeking to control the judiciary for its own purposes. This is about Ben Gvir and Smotrich, racist, hateful people. There is a fear, my friends, and I quote my my friend, the journalist Yossi Klein Halevi. People like to talk about startup nation, but the fear is that there will be a large-scale immigration on the part of the people who have been responsible for startup nation, or their children. We will see not an economic exodus from Israel, which is quite common. Witness how many Israelis you probably know who live in the United States. They often came for economic reasons, to seek their fortunes. In Israel, the story is, you know how you make a small fortune in Israel? You come with a large fortune because of the cost of living. Not true anymore. But what we would have is the first ideological exodus from Israel. These are existential threats. Not to Israel's security, but I will say to you that with the partial rebellion of military leaders and with the call on the part of some American Jews and American politicians to curtail military aid to Israel, all of which is spent in the United States. You need to know that. This signals to Israel's enemies, Iran, that Israel would not be prepared for an attack. This is dangerous. These are threats to Israel and to the very nature of the Jewish people. And so we are going through an identity crisis on this 75th anniversary. What is a Jewish state? What is a democratic state? Can you have a Jewish democratic state? What is the meaning of democracy? Most Americans believe, and many Israelis believe, that democracy is a mathematic. The majority rules. It's really very simple. If right now we voted, who wants sushi for lunch, who wants pizza for lunch, show of hands, whoever wins, that's what we're eating. Welcome to democracy. A majoritarian sense of democracy. But you see, democracy is not only mathematics. Democracy is about values. It means enshrining and safeguarding the rights of the minority. I invite us to go back to the name of the state itself. There was controversy when Israel was created as to what the name of the state would be. There were some people who thought it should be Judea, which would have made sense. Yehudah, the southern kingdom, was the kingdom that held out longer than the northern kingdom of Israel, but they went with Israel for many reasons. Number one, even though we are Jews, hence the term Judea, Yehudah, that's really not how we are framed in our sacred literature. It was always Yisrael, Beit Yisrael, Am Yisrael. But moreover, now I shall be a little playful. I believe that the reason why they chose Israel, Yisrael, is that it means to wrestle with God and to wrestle with yourself. And many American Jews never signed up for the wrestling match. We signed up for the feel-good version of Israel. We signed up for the movie Exodus. We signed up for occasional trips, and you heard how unoccasional those trips are. Birthright, which in many ways, in every way I support, but I have to ask what it means that we have to export our kids for Jewish identity. To what extent does that testify to the growing impoverishment of liberal Jewish life, the topic of my next book? Everything is at stake. Who we are as a people, what it means for us to have a faith. Those of us who came of age politically in the late 1960s, you know who you are. You recall that we marched against the war in Vietnam. We did not carry American flags. Quite the contrary. Some of us trashed them, burned them, or like the late Abby Hoffman, wore them as shirts. Not so in Israel. You can't get a flag in Israel now, they're sold out. Everyone owns a flag, and they take the flags to the streets. In Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, they wrap themselves in Israeli flags as pious Jews would wrap themselves in a talit. Demokratia, they scream, democracy. Already now, more than 1/4 of all Israelis have attended a protest, and the numbers grow with every Saturday night. We need parallel demonstrations in every American Jewish community. Our kids need it. We need it. Yossi Klein Halevi has said that we need 2 languages about Israel. We need to be bilingual. On the one hand, we need to push back against the forces of BDS. But on the other hand, we need to push back against those who would create the kind of state that our enemies say we are. We need study groups within synagogues to really understand the issues that are involved here. Most American Jews do not understand. This is an easy fix. We need to hold Jewish organizations responsible. A large sector of the Israeli public is turning to the diaspora and they're saying, be our partners. Help us reimagine the relationship. This is a matter of Jewish life and death. And you are allowed to say to Jewish organizations, if you're not speaking out, you don't get my money. You're allowed to say that. The Israeli popular song puts it this way, Ein li eretz acheret. I have no other country. I have no other country, even if my land is aflame. Just a word in Hebrew pierces my veins and my soul. With a painful body, with a hungry heart, here is my home. I will not stay silent because my country changed her face. I will not give up reminding her and singing in her ears until she opens her eyes. All of these lost objects. Anachnu achrayim, Avi Yonah said to me, my van driver. We are responsible. My sin in offering him a tip was I made a category error. I like to speak in alliteration, and this weekend it seems that my letter, in the words of Sesame Street, this weekend has been brought to you by the letter C. You see, at that moment I saw myself as a consumer of a service from Avi Yonah. He did not see me as a consumer. He saw me as someone with whom he lived in covenant. We are responsible. We need more of this in American Judaism. We need to be literate in our sources. We need to be able to have a Jewish language. The story is told about a cat pursuing a mouse, and the mouse ran into its hole. And then when the cat came sniffing around the hole, the mouse said, meow. The cat walked away. The fellow mouse asked his friend, what was that all about? And the mouse replied, and now you understand why it is helpful to know a second language. What is our first language? Americanism. What must be our second language? Judaism. point of my new book is that American Jews are fluent in the first language of Americanism, secularism, and individualism. But we need to become fluent in a second language of Judaism and of responsibility. P.S. Right before last Rosh Hashanah, I called Aviona. I still had his phone number. He remembered me. And he also remembered the exact address where he was taking me. He remembered the whole story. And I said to him, Aviona, I want you to know something. I have studied with the greatest teachers in the Jewish world. I have sat in classrooms and lecture halls, and I've heard the best of the best. Men and women who have written and published 20 and 30 books. But no teacher that I ever studied with ever taught me as much Judaism in as small a space and in as little an amount of time as you did that day from the front seat of your van at the Sonol station in Jerusalem. He was in tears, and he blessed me for a good year. Then he asked if he could bless my congregation as well. I send blessings to you and to your community, that you should have a good and sweet year. A year later, I pass that blessing on to you. But I end with these words. We will say in just a few short days, and we're already starting to do so, L'Shana Tova, a good year. L'Shana Tova Tikatevu, may you be inscribed for a good year. L'Shana Tova Umituka, a good and sweet year. I must now tell you that there is a greeting that many Israelis use at this season, and I do not know how many of you have ever heard this. Shnat Dvash, a year of honey. A year of honey. Now, if this sweetness is what is at stake here, then you could dip your apple into sugar, and it would count. But you dip your apple into honey. Why honey? Oh, of course, the Torah says that the land of Israel is a land that flows with milk and honey. I get it. But what's up with honey? It's sweet and it's messy. What I've determined is necessary is that we embrace the sweetness of Jewish life, but also let us recognize it can be very messy as well. But what should never be messy is the loving memory that you have of your husband, your father, your father-in-law, who would have been 90 years old. That's a long life. But you and I know, my friends, it's never long enough. The human heart and the human soul get very greedy. We want more. So let us embrace that goodness and that sweetness. L'Shana Tova Mituka, a good and sweet year, and to all of you, and to this wonderful congregation. And if I may single her out and embarrass her, to this marvelous rabbi whom you have, who I knew when she was very young, and who, in the words of Rabbi Bob Dylan, has stayed forever young. Playful, kind, smart, cool, and thoroughly engaged in the life of this community that gave birth to her, and which she now gives birth to. Jessica, it doesn't get any better. You are very blessed. as are all of you. Thank you so much.